Hey there, night owls and history lovers. Tonight we're diving into a story that spans 5,000 years, crosses every continent and touches your life right now, whether you know it or not. This is the story of opium, from ancient joy plant to modern killer, from medicine to weapon, from salvation to absolute devastation. And fair warning, this journey gets dark. Really dark. But if you're here for the long haul, settle in. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's explore how one simple flower changed the entire world. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep dives into history, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. I genuinely appreciate it, and it helps me keep making these videos for you. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing the night crew check in from around the world. Now, let's start with something you might have seen on the news. Picture this. A paramedic rushes into an apartment, naloxone kit in hand. Someone's on the floor, lips blue, not breathing. Fentanyl overdose. The paramedic administers the reversal drug, does chest compressions, and after terrifying seconds the person gasps back to life. Another save, another close call, another statistic in America's ongoing opioid crisis. But here's what most people don't realise. That scene, that emergency, that desperate fight between life and death over a drug derived from a flower. It's not new, it's not modern, it's ancient. 5,000 years ancient. And the same plant that nearly killed that person on the apartment floor once brought the mighty Chinese empire to its knees, funded the British conquest of half the world, and shaped the very foundations of modern medicine. That's the power of opium. That's the legacy of the poppy. Tonight, we're going to trace this flower's journey through human civilization. We'll walk through Sumerian temples where priests called it the joy plant. We'll stand on Chinese docks where tons of the drug were destroyed in defiance. We'll watch empires go to war over the right to sell addiction, and we'll end up right back here in the 21st century, where synthetic versions of this ancient drug are killing more people than car accidents. The story of opium is the story of humanity's eternal struggle with pleasure and pain, with healing and harm, with the desperate human need to escape suffering, even when that escape becomes suffering itself. So take a deep breath. This is going to be a long night, but by the end you'll understand how deeply this one plant has woven itself into the fabric of human history. Let's begin at the very beginning. Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, roughly 3,400 years before the birth of Christ. The Sumerians, one of humanity's first great civilizations, are cultivating fields along the Tigris and Euphrates. They're growing barley for bread, wheat for beer, and something else. Something special. A delicate flower with papery petals in shades of white, pink, and deep crimson. The opium poppy, Papaver somniferum. Its scientific name literally means sleep-bringing poppy. And the Sumerians, they had a different name for it. Hulgil, the joy plant. Now, we don't know exactly who first discovered opium's properties. That knowledge is lost to time, buried under 5,000 years of sand and silence. But we know the Sumerians understood this plant intimately. They knew that if you scored the unripe seed pod with a knife, just at dawn when the morning was still cool, a milky white sap would ooze out. They knew that if you let that sap dry in the sun, it would turn sticky and brown. And they knew that if you collected that dried resin and consumed it, something remarkable happened. Pain disappeared, anxiety melted away. Sleep came easily, filled with vivid, colourful dreams, and for a few precious hours the brutality of ancient life, the back-breaking labour, the constant threat of disease and violence, all of it faded into a warm, euphoric haze. Archaeological evidence shows us just how important this plant was to the Sumerians. Clay tablets found at Nippur, a major Sumerian spiritual centre south of what's now Baghdad, contain some of the earliest written references to the poppy. These tablets, inscribed in cuneiform script, describe the collection of poppy juice in the early morning hours. The process was meticulous. Farmers would walk through the fields at first light, using small iron scrapers to make shallow cuts in the seed pods. The latex would seep out thick and white like milk. By afternoon, it had oxidized and darkened, ready to be scraped off and collected in clay vessels. But this wasn't just agriculture, this was sacred work. The Sumerians didn't separate medicine from religion the way we do today. Healing was spiritual, and the poppy, with its dream-inducing, pain-erasing properties, was seen as a gift from the gods. temple priests used opium in religious ceremonies. They believed it opened doorways to the divine, allowed communication with the spirit world, helped them interpret the will of the gods. And maybe they were right, in their own way. Opium does open doorways, though perhaps not the ones they imagined. There's a fascinating archaeological artifact that speaks to this connection between opium and the divine. It's a small figurine, excavated from a Sumerian site depicting a goddess. And this goddess, her hair is adorned with what appear to be poppy seed capsules. Her eyes are closed, her face serene, peaceful. She looks, quite frankly, sedated. Some scholars believe she represents a deity of sleep or dreams. Others think she's associated with fertility, since poppies produce thousands of seeds. But regardless of her specific identity, the message is clear. This plant was sacred. This plant was powerful. This plant was central to how the Sumerians understood their world. And it wasn't just for religious use. Opium was medicine. One of humanity's first genuine painkillers. If you had a toothache, they'd give you opium. Broken bone, opium. Couldn't sleep, opium. Chronic pain from injury or disease, you guessed it. The Sumerians had discovered something that modern medicine still relies on today. Opioids are extraordinarily effective at managing pain. They work by binding to specific receptors in the brain and spinal cord, essentially blocking pain signals before they can be fully processed. The Sumerians didn't know the neuroscience, of course, but they knew it worked, and that was enough. As Sumerian civilization flourished and eventually gave way to the Assyrians and Babylonians, knowledge of the opium poppy spread. The Assyrians adopted Sumerian cultivation techniques and expanded them. They called the poppy juice arat papal, possibly the root of our word papava, the scientific genus name. Assyrian medical texts describe using opium for everything from headaches to digestive issues to insomnia. They knew it was powerful. They knew it had to be used carefully. And yes, they knew it could kill you if you took too much. But in an era before aspirin, before anesthesia, before any real understanding of how to manage pain, opium was nothing short of miraculous. The knowledge travelled along trade routes. Mesopotamian merchants carried opium to Egypt, to the eastern Mediterranean, to Persia. And everywhere it went, civilizations recognized its value. Everywhere it went, people began cultivating their own poppies. The plant adapted beautifully to different climates, different soils. It thrived in the dry warmth of the Middle East. And slowly, quietly, opium began its journey around the world. But here's what's crucial to understand about this early period. The Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, they treated opium with respect. It was medicine. It was sacred. It was powerful, yes, but it was used sparingly, carefully, with an understanding that this substance could both heal and harm. There was balance, there was restraint. That balance, that restraint, it wouldn't last forever. But for now, in these early days, opium was simply the joy plant, a gift that made life a little more bearable in a brutal, unforgiving world. As the centuries rolled on, opium's reputation only grew. By 1500 BCE, ancient Egypt had fully embraced the poppy. The Egyptians cultivated their own varieties in the region around Thebes, producing what they called opium thebaicum. This wasn't for everyone, though. Egyptian opium was restricted, carefully controlled by the priestly class. It was reserved for priests, for magicians, for warriors heading into battle. The common people, they didn't get access. This was powerful medicine, powerful magic, and the pharaohs wanted to keep that power concentrated in the right hands. We know about Egyptian opium use from one of the oldest medical texts ever discovered, the Ebers Papyrus, dating back to around 1500 BCE. This remarkable document, over 20 meters long when unrolled, contains over 700 medical formulas and remedies, and opium shows up repeatedly. The papyrus describes opium's sedative and hypnotic properties in explicit detail. It recommends opium for calming crying children, for helping people sleep through pain, for treating various ailments. The Egyptians had figured out dosing, at least to some degree. They knew that a little brought relief. Too much brought death. Egyptian surgical practices also relied heavily on opium. Before the concept of anesthesia, before anyone understood you could render someone unconscious for surgery, the Egyptians had a workaround. Opium-soaked sponges. These were called spongia somnifera, sleep-bringing sponges. Before a surgical procedure, the physician would soak a sponge in a mixture of opium, mandrake, and other herbs. Then have the patient inhale the fumes or place it against their nose and mouth. The patient would drift into a semi-conscious state, pain dulled, awareness dimmed. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing, and for some surgeries that little bit of relief made the difference between a patient surviving the procedure or dying from shock and pain. There's something darkly poetic about this, isn't there? 5,000 years ago, humans were already using opium to escape the horrors of medical treatment. The same pattern we see today with surgical painkillers started right here, in ancient Egypt, with soaked sponges and desperate patients seeking relief from the knife. The Egyptians also incorporated opium into their death rituals. Opium residues have been found in burial chambers, in vessels placed alongside mummies. Some scholars believe opium was thought to ease the soul's transition to the afterlife, to calm the deceased on their journey to the land of the dead. Whether that's true or just speculation, we can't know for certain, but we do know that opium was intimately connected with Egyptian concepts of life, death, sleep, and dreams. It was woven into the very fabric of their civilization. And then there's the trade. Egypt didn't exist in isolation. Egyptian merchants travelled extensively throughout the Mediterranean, up into Asia Minor, across to Greece and beyond, and they carried opium with them. Clay vessels filled with dried opium resin, small, portable, incredibly valuable. Opium became a trade commodity, one of the earliest luxury goods exchanged between civilizations. A merchant could buy opium in Thebes, transport it to Athens or Babylon or anywhere else that valued the drug, and sell it for a substantial profit. The economics of the opium trade, the profit motive that would later fuel wars and empires, it started here, in these ancient exchange networks. What's fascinating is how consistent the pattern was across different ancient civilizations. Whether Sumerian, Assyrian, Babylonian or Egyptian, the story was the same. Opium was powerful medicine. Opium was connected to the divine. Opium required respect and caution, and opium, if misused, could destroy you. Every culture that encountered the poppy learned these lessons. Some learned them quickly, others learned them the hard way, through overdoses and addiction and death, but everyone learned. By the time we reach ancient Greece, opium had been a part of human civilization for over 2,000 years. It had moved from Mesopotamia to Egypt to the Mediterranean coast, and the Greeks, with their love of philosophy, medicine and mythology, they took opium and ran with it in fascinating directions. The Greeks gave us some of our most enduring concepts about this drug, concepts we still reference today without even realizing it. Let's start with the mythology, because the Greeks couldn't help but weave opium into their stories about the gods. The god Hypnos, personification of sleep. His twin brother Thanatos, personification of death. And Morpheus, the god of dreams, who would later give his name to morphine, the most famous opium derivative. These weren't random associations. The Greeks understood that opium operated in the liminal spaces between wakefulness and sleep, between life and death, between reality and dreams. It was the substance that blurred boundaries that took you from one state to another. Homer, in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, makes references to opium or opium-like substances. In the Odyssey, Helen of Troy uses a drug called nepenthe to ease the grief and pain of warriors returning from battle. Many scholars believe nepenthe was opium, or at least an opium-containing mixture. Helen mixes it with wine and serves it to the suffering men, and it brings them peace, quiets their tormented minds, helps them forget their sorrows. The description is vivid. Whoever drinks this mixture once it is mixed in the bowl will not shed a tear the entire day, not even if his mother and father should die, not even if they should murder his brother or beloved son before his eyes. That's opium, all right. That's the erasure of emotional and physical pain, the temporary reprieve from suffering that opium provides. But while the Greeks loved their mythology, they were also the birthplace of scientific medicine, and this is where Hippocrates enters the story. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, the man whose oath doctors still reference today. Hippocrates looked at opium and said something radical for his time. There's nothing magical about this. It's not divine intervention. It's not the gods granting relief. It's a plant with specific measurable effects on the human body. It can be understood through observation and reason. This was revolutionary. Up until Hippocrates, most cultures treated opium as sacred, mystical, beyond human comprehension. But Hippocrates stripped away the mythology. He documented opium's effects clinically. He noted that it relieved pain, induced sleep, Slowed breathing caused constipation. He prescribed it for specific conditions and warned against overuse. He tried to establish dosing guidelines. Though without modern measurement tools, this was more art than science. But the principle was there. Opium was medicine, and medicine required careful, thoughtful application. Other Greek physicians built on Hippocrates' work. Dioscorides, a Greek physician serving in the Roman army during the 1st century CE, wrote one of the most comprehensive texts on medicinal plants ever produced, De Materia Medica, and in it he dedicated significant space to opium. His description is worth quoting. A little of it, taken as much as a grain of herbum, is a pain easer, and a sleep causer, and a digester. But being drank too much, it hurts, making men lethargical, and it kills. There it is, right there in the 1st century. The fundamental paradox of opium. In small amounts it heals. In large amounts it kills. The line between medicine and poison is terrifyingly thin. The Greeks also developed various opium preparations. They mixed opium with wine, with honey, with various herbs to enhance or modify its effects. They experimented with different routes of administration, oral consumption, suppositories, inhalation of vapours. They were in many ways the first pharmaceutical researchers trying to optimize opium's benefits while minimizing its risks. But the Greeks weren't naive. They saw addiction. They saw people who started using opium for legitimate pain relief and ended up unable to function without it. They saw the withdrawal symptoms when regular users tried to stop: sweating, shaking, pain, desperate craving. Greek physicians debated whether this was a disease, a moral failing, or simply the natural consequence of using such a powerful substance. Sound familiar? We're still having that same debate today, 2,000 years later. And then there's the darker side of Greek opium use. Opium as a tool for suicide. The Greeks, particularly the Stoics, believed that a person had the right to choose their own death under certain circumstances. Terminal illness, unbearable suffering, loss of all that made life worth living, and opium, mixed with other substances like hemlock, provided what was seen as a dignified exit. Peaceful, painless, a gentle drift from life into death. Whether you agree with that philosophy or not, it shows just how powerful opium was in the ancient world. It could ease you out of life as easily as it could ease you through it. As Greek culture spread through Alexander the Great's conquests and eventually merged with Roman civilization, opium spread too. The Romans adopted Greek medical practices wholesale, and that included extensive use of opium. Roman physicians like Galen prescribed opium constantly. Galen served as physician to several Roman emperors and gladiators, dealing with the most severe injuries imaginable. And opium was his go-to solution for pain management. Broken bones, deep wounds, post-surgical pain, opium, opium, opium. There's even speculation that Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, was addicted to opium. Some historians point to references in his writings to a daily medicinal preparation, possibly theriac, a complex mixture that included opium as a key ingredient. Whether he was actually dependent on it, or just used it medicinally, we can't know for certain. But the fact that even an emperor, with all the wealth and power in the world, might have fallen into opium's grip, that tells you something about the drug's seductive power. The Romans also expanded opium cultivation throughout their empire. Poppies grew in Italy, in Gaul, in North Africa, in the Middle East. Anywhere the Romans conquered, poppies followed. And with the poppies came the knowledge of opium extraction and use. By the height of the Roman Empire, opium was available throughout the known world. It was medicine, it was recreation, it was spiritual aid, it was poison, it was suicide method. It was all of these things at once, depending on who used it and why. But as the Roman Empire crumbled and Europe descended into the chaos of the early Middle Ages, opium knowledge didn't disappear. It moved east. And in the Islamic world, during the golden age of Islamic civilization, opium medicine reached new heights of sophistication. The Islamic Golden Age, roughly from the 8th to the 14th century, was a period of extraordinary intellectual and scientific achievement. While Europe struggled through the Dark Ages, scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus and Cordoba were preserving and expanding upon Greek and Roman medical knowledge. And when it came to opium, Islamic physicians made discoveries that wouldn't be matched in the West for centuries. Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, was perhaps the greatest physician of the Islamic Golden Age. His masterwork, the Canon of Medicine, completed around 1025 CE, was the standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and Europe for over 500 years, and in it, Avicenna dedicated substantial sections to opium. He described its effects in meticulous detail. He documented proper dosing for different conditions. He noted the dangers of prolonged use. And crucially, he recognized addiction as a medical condition, not a moral failure. This was groundbreaking. Avicenna understood that regular opium use changed something fundamental in the body, that people who used it consistently would develop tolerance, would need higher doses to achieve the same effect, would suffer terribly if they stopped suddenly. He described withdrawal symptoms with clinical precision: muscle aches, anxiety, insomnia, sweating, tremors, intense craving. And he attempted to develop treatment protocols for helping people overcome opium dependence. Most didn't work particularly well, but the fact that he tried, that he approached addiction as a solvable medical problem that was centuries ahead of his time. Other Islamic physicians expanded on this work. Rhazes, another towering figure in Islamic medicine, wrote extensively about opium's therapeutic uses and its potential for harm. He emphasized the importance of using the minimum effective dose, of trying other remedies first before resorting to opium. He understood that while opium was sometimes necessary, it should never be the first choice. The Islamic world also refined opium preparation techniques. They developed more sophisticated extraction methods, creating more potent and more consistent preparations. They experimented with combining opium with other substances to enhance certain effects or reduce side effects. They created complex medicinal mixtures, the most famous being theriac, a legendary cure-all that supposedly contained up to 64 different ingredients, with opium as the centerpiece. Theriac is worth talking about for a moment, because it became one of the most sought-after medicines in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. It was expensive, difficult to make, and supposedly effective against everything from snake bites to plague. The opium content meant it definitely made people feel better, even if it wasn't actually curing anything. Theriac was traded along the Silk Road, shipped from the Middle East to China, to India to Europe. It was one of the first truly global pharmaceutical products, and it was essentially fancy opium mixed with a bunch of other stuff. But here's what's important about the Islamic contribution to opium medicine. They approached it scientifically. They didn't just use opium blindly. They studied it. They documented effects. They tried to understand dosing and toxicity. They recognized that individual responses varied, that what worked for one person might not work for another. They were doing empirical medicine at a time when much of Europe was still relying on prayer and bloodletting. There's a remarkable Persian manuscript from the 16th century called Afyunir, which translates roughly to Concerning Opium. It's believed to be the first comprehensive treatise dedicated entirely to opium and addiction. The author, a physician named Ahmad al-Din Mahmud, drew on his clinical experience treating opium users. He described the plant's morphology, the extraction process, medicinal uses, and crucially the progression of addiction and strategies for treatment. This manuscript wasn't widely known in Europe, but it represents the culmination of centuries of Islamic medical knowledge about opium. It's a reminder that while we often credit European physicians with advancing opium medicine, the Islamic world was far ahead for a very long time. The Silk Road, that vast network of trade routes connecting east and west, became a highway for opium knowledge. Merchants carried opium itself, of course, but they also carried techniques, recipes, medical texts. Chinese physicians learned from Persian doctors. Indian healers shared knowledge with Arab traders. Europeans got their hands on Islamic medical texts and began translating them. Opium, by the medieval period, was truly a global medicine. In medieval Europe, opium had a complicated status. It was known, certainly. European physicians had access to translated Greek and Islamic medical texts that described opium's properties. But actual opium was expensive, difficult to obtain, and often adulterated or fake. If you were wealthy enough, you could buy theriac or other opium-containing medicines. If you were poor, you suffered. This created a strange situation where opium was simultaneously mundane and exotic, well known in theory but rare in practice. That changed as European trade networks expanded and, eventually, as European powers began colonizing the world. But before we get to colonialism and the catastrophic consequences that followed, let's pause for a moment. We're about 3,500 years into our story, and so far opium has been primarily medicinal. Yes, there's been recreational use. Yes, there's been addiction. Yes, people have died from overdoses, but those were side effects, not the primary purpose. Opium was medicine that sometimes went wrong. That's about to change, dramatically, violently, with consequences that still echo today. Because in the next chapter of our story, opium stops being primarily about healing and starts being about profit, empire, war, and the deliberate, calculated creation of the largest drug addiction epidemic the world had ever seen. But we'll get there. For now, take a breath. We're about to enter some of the darkest chapters in human history. And it all starts with tea. Britain had a problem, a big one. And like so many British problems in the 18th and 19th centuries, it came down to trade, money, and an insatiable appetite for luxury goods they couldn't produce themselves. The British people had become absolutely obsessed with tea, not just the aristocracy, everyone. By the 1700s, tea was the national drink. Workers spent up to 5% of their household budget on it. It was served at breakfast, with lunch, at dinner, during social visits, at every conceivable occasion. Tea houses and tea gardens dotted London and every other British city. The nation was addicted, not physiologically like with opium, but culturally, socially, economically. And there was only one place to get good tea, China. The Chinese had perfected tea cultivation over thousands of years. They had the best varieties, the best processing techniques, the best quality. British attempts to grow tea elsewhere had failed miserably. So Britain imported massive quantities of Chinese tea, year after year, ship after ship. And they paid for it in silver, because the Chinese didn't want anything Britain produced. This was the crux of the problem. The Chinese economy was enormous, sophisticated, and largely self-sufficient. They had silk, porcelain, tea, spices, everything a civilization could want. British goods, woolens, manufactured items held no appeal. Chinese merchants would accept silver as payment, but nothing else. So the British trade ships sailed to China, loaded with silver, exchanged it for tea, silk, and porcelain, and sailed home, and British silver reserves began to drain. By the late 1700s, this trade imbalance was becoming unsustainable. Britain was essentially hemorrhaging silver to feed its tea habit. The British East India Company, which held a monopoly on British trade with Asia, was desperate for a solution. They needed something, anything, that Chinese merchants would buy in sufficient quantities to balance the trade deficit. And they found it. In India, in the form of opium. India, under British colonial rule, had perfect conditions for poppy cultivation. The climate was right. The soil was right. And the British East India Company had absolute control over vast agricultural regions. So they made a decision that would change history. They would turn India into an opium production factory. Farmers in Bengal and other regions were essentially forced to grow poppies instead of food crops. The company provided seeds, set quotas, and bought the harvested opium at fixed prices that left the farmers with little profit. This wasn't a free market. This was colonial exploitation turned toward drug production. The process was industrialized. Fields upon fields of poppies stretching to the horizon. At harvest time, workers would score the seed pods and collect the latex, just like the Sumerians had done 5,000 years earlier, but now on a massive scale. The raw opium was processed at company factories, formed into balls or blocks, stamped with the company seal and prepared for export. And the destination? China. Now here's the thing. Opium wasn't unknown in China. The Chinese had been using opium medicinally for centuries, imported small quantities from Arab traders. But it was expensive, rare, used sparingly. What the British did was flood the Chinese market with cheap opium on a scale never seen before. They created supply, which created demand, which created addiction. And they did it deliberately, knowingly, because it solved their trade problem. The early shipments were tentative, a few chests here and there. But Chinese merchants quickly discovered that opium sold exceptionally well. Why? Because in the late 1600s, the practice of smoking tobacco had spread to China from the Americas, and someone, we don't know who, discovered that if you mixed opium with tobacco, or eventually just smoked opium by itself, the effects hit faster and harder than eating it. Smoking opium became fashionable, then popular, then epidemic. British and Chinese smugglers worked together to evade Chinese import restrictions. The British ships would anchor off the coast outside Chinese territorial waters. Chinese smugglers would row out in small boats, purchase opium, and row back to shore to distribute it. Chinese officials were bribed to look the other way. A vast underground network developed, and opium flowed into China like water. The numbers are staggering. In 1729, about 200 chests of opium entered China annually. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds of the drug. By 1790, that had increased to 4,000 chests. By 1820, 10,000 chests. By 1838, the peak before the First Opium War, 40,000 chests. That's roughly 2,800 tons of opium per year flooding into China. To put that in perspective, that's enough to supply millions of addicts, and millions became addicted. Opium dens sprang up in every Chinese city. These weren't glamorous establishments. They were dark, cramped rooms filled with smoke where men, and occasionally women, would lie on wooden bunks smoking pipe after pipe of opium until they drifted into unconsciousness. Some dens were relatively respectable, catering to merchants and officials. Others were squalid, dangerous places where desperate addicts shared pipes and space with criminals and the desperately poor. The social cost was catastrophic. Productive workers became unemployable, unable to function without their daily opium. Families fell apart as fathers, sometimes mothers, spent every coin on the drug. Children were neglected, left to fend for themselves while parents chased their next dose. Crime skyrocketed as addicts stole to fund their habit. Agricultural production declined as rural workers became dependent on opium. The fabric of Chinese society was tearing apart, and the economic impact was just as severe. For the first time in centuries, silver was flowing out of China instead of in. Chinese merchants paid for British opium with silver, reversing the trade imbalance that had previously favoured China. The Chinese economy began to suffer. Silver shortages meant inflation, making life harder for ordinary people. Tax revenues declined. The government's ability to function effectively was compromised. Chinese officials watched this catastrophe unfold with growing alarm. The emperor issued edict after edict banning opium importation and use. In 1729, in 1796, in 1814, in 1831. None of them worked. The profit was too enormous, the corruption too widespread, the addiction too established. Banning opium was like trying to hold back the ocean with your hands. But in 1839, the emperor decided enough was enough. He appointed an official named Lin Zexu as special imperial commissioner with one mandate: end the opium trade, by any means necessary. Lin Zexu was an interesting choice. He was a scholar, a high-ranking bureaucrat, and a man of uncompromising principles. He genuinely believed that opium was destroying China, and that the British drug trafficking was an act of war, even if not officially declared, and he was willing to take radical action to stop it. Lin began by studying the problem. He read everything he could find about opium, about addiction, about the British trade networks. He consulted with former addicts, with medical practitioners, with other officials. He wanted to understand the enemy before confronting it, and what he learned horrified him. The depth of the addiction crisis, the complicity of Chinese officials, the sheer scale of British smuggling operations. It was worse than he'd imagined. In March 1839, Lin arrived in Canton, the centre of British trade with China, and immediately took action. He surrounded the foreign factories, the warehouses and residences where British and other foreign merchants operated. He demanded they surrender all opium in their possession, all of it, every chest, every ball, every ounce, and he made it clear. No one was leaving until the opium was handed over. The British merchants initially refused. They claimed the opium wasn't theirs personally, it belonged to British companies back in India and England. They couldn't just give it away. Lin was unmoved. He cut off food supplies to the factories. He threatened to execute Chinese servants working for the foreigners. He made it clear he would wait as long as necessary, and if anyone tried to escape, they would be arrested and likely executed. After 6 weeks of standoff, the merchants capitulated. They had no choice. Over the course of several weeks, they turned over 20,000 chests of opium, over 400 tons of the drug, worth millions of pounds sterling. An absolutely staggering amount. It was the largest drug seizure in history up to that point, and arguably ever. And then Lin did something extraordinary. He didn't just confiscate the opium, he destroyed it, publicly, as a demonstration of China's determination to end the trade. He had workers dig 3 large trenches near the shore. They filled the trenches with the opium mixed with salt and lime to break it down and flushed it all into the sea. The process took 3 days. Crowds gathered to watch. The mixture turned the water brown and oily. The smell was overpowering, and when it was done, 400 tons of British opium had been rendered worthless, washed away into the ocean. Lin also wrote a remarkable letter to Queen Victoria. It was formal, respectful, but firm. He essentially said, "Your merchants are poisoning our people with a drug that's illegal in your own country. How is this moral? How is this acceptable? If your people sent poisonous goods to Britain, wouldn't you stop them? Why should China tolerate what Britain would not?" The letter is a fascinating document, a plea for basic human decency between nations. It appealed to shared values, to common humanity, to the idea that surely the British Crown wouldn't knowingly support mass addiction and death for profit. The letter never reached Queen Victoria. British officials intercepted it. It was later published in the Times of London, where it generated some public debate, but ultimately changed nothing. Because while Lin's letter appealed to morality, the British government's response would be based on something else entirely: profit, power, and imperial pride. When news of the opium destruction reached London, the response was outrage. British merchants demanded compensation. They claimed Lin had stolen their property, that the Chinese government owed them millions of pounds. Never mind that the property was an illegal drug being smuggled into China in violation of Chinese law. Never mind that the opium trade was morally indefensible. The merchants wanted their money, and they had powerful supporters in Parliament. There was debate in Britain about whether to go to war over opium. Some members of Parliament were genuinely uncomfortable with the idea of forcing China to accept drug imports. A young William Gladstone, who would later become Prime Minister, gave an impassioned speech calling the opium trade morally indefensible and warning that history would judge Britain harshly for this action. He was right, of course, but he was also voted down. The majority argument was simpler. China had destroyed British property and insulted British honour. The principles of free trade were at stake. British merchants had a right to sell their goods, whatever those goods might be, and no foreign power could dictate terms to the British Empire. It was imperialism wrapped in the language of commerce, violence justified by economics. In November 1839, a British naval expedition set sail for China. The First Opium War had begun, and it would be a massacre. The Qing dynasty's military forces were impressive on paper. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, massive war junks, ancient forts bristling with cannons. But impressive on paper meant nothing against modern British military technology. The British brought paddle-wheel gunboats that could manoeuvre in shallow water where Chinese junks couldn't follow. They had Congreve rockets, explosive artillery shells, percussion-lock muskets that fired reliably even in wet conditions. The Chinese had courage and numbers. The British had an overwhelming technological advantage. Battle after battle went the same way. British ships would approach Chinese forts or cities. Chinese forces would fire their antiquated cannons. British ships would close distance and unleash devastating broadsides. Chinese defences would crumble. British Marines would land and capture strategic positions. Chinese forces would retreat in disarray. The war wasn't even close. At the Battle of Chuenpi in January 1841, British forces destroyed 11 Chinese war junks and captured the Chuenpi forts in less than a day. At Canton, British troops occupied the city and forced Chinese authorities to pay a ransom to prevent total destruction. At the Battle of Qingqiang, British forces defeated a Chinese garrison and opened the Grand Canal, threatening Beijing itself. Everywhere the British went, they won. By 1842, the Qing government had no choice but to sue for peace. The resulting Treaty of Nanking was the first of what came to be known as the Unequal Treaties, and it was devastating for China. The terms included cession of Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity, opening of 5 Chinese ports to British trade and residents, payment of 21 million silver dollars in reparations, including compensation for the destroyed opium, fixed tariffs on British goods, preventing China from protecting its own industries, and humiliatingly, no mention of opium. The treaty didn't legalise the drug trade, but it didn't prohibit it either, leaving a loophole the British cheerfully exploited. Hong Kong deserves special mention. It was, in 1842, essentially a barren rock with a small fishing village. The British Foreign Secretary famously dismissed it as a barren island with hardly a house upon it, but its deep natural harbour and strategic location made it invaluable for controlling trade with China. The British turned it into a colony that would last 155 years, until 1997. And for much of that time, Hong Kong's prosperity was built on the opium trade. Warehouses full of opium, ships loading and unloading opium, Chinese junks purchasing opium to smuggle into mainland China. It was a monument to drug trafficking, flying the British flag. The Treaty of Nanking wasn't the end. Other Western powers wanted their share. The United States negotiated a similar treaty in 1844. France followed. Russia, every major power demanded the same privileges the British had won through war. The most favoured nation clause in these treaties meant that any concession granted to one foreign power had to be granted to all. China was forced to open wider and wider, with less and less control over its own economy and sovereignty. And the opium kept flowing. More than before. British merchants, no longer even slightly restrained by fear of Chinese enforcement, ramped up shipments. By the 1850s, an estimated 10% of Chinese males were regular opium users. The addiction crisis was worse than ever. Chinese society continued to deteriorate under the weight of mass addiction. And the Chinese government, weakened by war and forced to accept foreign domination, could do nothing to stop it. But wait, it gets worse. Because the British decided that the Treaty of Nanking wasn't enough. They wanted more ports opened, they wanted free travel throughout China's interior, they wanted foreign diplomats in Beijing, they wanted opium legalized, and when China resisted, Britain went to war again, this time with France as an ally. The Second Opium War, also called the Arrow War, started in 1856 over a minor incident involving a British-registered ship. But the real cause was British desire for greater commercial and political access to China, and France, eager to expand its influence in Asia, happily joined. The war followed the same pattern as the first, Western forces with superior technology crushing Chinese resistance. But this time, the humiliation went even deeper. In 1860, British and French forces marched to Beijing itself. The emperor fled, and in one of the most infamous acts of cultural destruction in history, British and French troops looted and burned the old summer palace, Yuanming Yuan. This wasn't a military target. It was a royal garden palace, filled with priceless art, historical artifacts, treasures accumulated over centuries. The troops spent days looting everything they could carry: jade, silk, porcelain, jewellery, golden objects, ancient books. They stole it all, and then they burned the complex to the ground. The destruction took 3 days. Over 100 buildings reduced to ruins, irreplaceable cultural heritage destroyed forever. Why? Partly as punishment, partly as intimidation, partly because they could. It was a message: resist us, and we will destroy everything you value, and it worked. The Chinese government signed the Treaty of Tientsin, which went far beyond the previous treaties. Opium trade was explicitly legalized. 10 more ports were opened. Foreign diplomats could reside in Beijing. Christian missionaries could travel and proselytize freely throughout China. And China had to pay massive war reparations. This period, from 1839 to 1860 and beyond, became known in China as the beginning of the century of humiliation. It's not an exaggeration. China, one of the world's oldest and most sophisticated civilizations, was systematically subjugated by foreign powers, forced to accept a trade in addictive drugs, and had its cultural heritage literally burned to ashes. The memory of this humiliation is still alive in China today. It shapes Chinese foreign policy, drives Chinese nationalism, explains China's fierce insistence on sovereignty and non-interference. When you understand the Opium Wars, you understand so much about modern China. But let's not lose sight of the human cost. Behind the treaties and the battles and the geopolitics were millions of real people whose lives were destroyed by opium. Fathers who abandoned their children for the pipe, mothers who sold their daughters to fund addiction, workers who could no longer work, families that fell apart, communities that collapsed, and all of it was created deliberately by British merchants and protected by British gunboats because there was profit in addiction. This wasn't just trade. This was weaponized addiction, the systematic creation and exploitation of human suffering for economic gain, and it worked. British merchants made fortunes, the British East India Company's finances stabilised, British silver reserves recovered, the tea kept flowing, and millions of Chinese people descended into addiction, poverty, and death. The opium trade between India and China continued for decades after the wars ended. It didn't finally wind down until the early 20th century, as Chinese nationalist movements gained strength and international attitudes toward narcotics began to shift. But by then, the damage was done. The pattern was established. Opium had transformed from an ancient medicine into an instrument of empire. And the lessons learned, that addictive drugs could be weapons, that addiction could be deliberately cultivated for profit, those lessons would shape the future of the global drug trade right up to the present day. Now, while all this was happening in China, something else was occurring in the West. Scientists were starting to understand opium in new ways. They were asking, what makes opium work? What specific substance in the opium latex produces these effects? And in 1804, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner answered that question. He isolated the active ingredient. He called it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, and in doing so, he created something far more powerful, far more dangerous than raw opium had ever been. Morphine is approximately 10 times more potent than opium, gram for gram. It's pure, consistent, easily dosed. Serturner had performed the first isolation of an alkaloid from a plant, pioneering a technique that would revolutionize medicine and give us aspirin, quinine, caffeine, and countless other pure pharmaceutical compounds. It was a genuine scientific breakthrough. It was also, in the wrong hands, absolutely devastating. Initially, morphine was hailed as a miracle drug. Doctors loved it. It provided reliable pain relief. It was stronger than opium, so smaller doses were needed. It didn't have the inconsistencies of raw opium, which varied in potency depending on source and preparation. Surgeons could finally offer real anesthesia. Patients with chronic pain could find relief. Cancer sufferers could die with dignity instead of agony. Morphine was everything 19th century medicine needed. And then came the American Civil War. 4 years of brutal conflict, hundreds of thousands wounded, field surgeons amputating shattered limbs, soldiers suffering from dysentery, infections, untreatable pain, and morphine, liberally distributed to anyone who needed it, which was almost everyone. Soldiers were given morphine tablets to carry. Medics had morphine in their kits. Hospitals distributed it freely. It saved countless lives, prevented unimaginable suffering. But it also created what came to be called the soldier's disease, morphine addiction among Civil War veterans. Estimates vary, but historians believe tens of thousands of veterans left the war addicted to morphine. They'd received it for legitimate injuries, used it for months or years during and after the war, and by the time they tried to stop, they couldn't. The withdrawal was too severe, the craving too intense. They were trapped. And here's where things get darkly ironic. In 1853, just before the Civil War, the hypodermic syringe was invented. Suddenly, morphine didn't have to be taken orally. It could be injected directly into the bloodstream, producing effects in minutes instead of hours. This was presented as a major medical advance, and in some ways it was. Injected morphine provided faster, more reliable pain relief, but it also produced a much more intense high, and therefore much more rapid addiction. There was a widespread belief in the medical community, completely false, that injected morphine was less addictive than oral opium or morphine. The reasoning, if you can call it that, was that addiction was caused by the drug being absorbed through the stomach, and that bypassing the digestive system would somehow prevent dependency. This is, of course, complete nonsense. Injecting morphine is, if anything, more addictive than oral administration, because the rapid onset of effects reinforces the behaviour more strongly. But doctors believed the myth, and they prescribed injected morphine freely, confidently assuring patients there was no risk of addiction. The results were predictable. Morphine addiction spread beyond war veterans into the general population, and it wasn't just men. Women who were discouraged from drinking alcohol or using other recreational drugs found morphine socially acceptable. It was medicine, after all. Their doctors prescribed it for female troubles, anxiety, headaches, pretty much any complaint, and morphine was effective at making those problems feel better, at least temporarily. So women used it, became dependent, and found themselves trapped in addiction. Late 19th century morphine addiction had a particular demographic pattern. Middle-aged, middle-class women, respectable wives and mothers suffering in silence, dependent on a drug their doctor had prescribed, unable to stop, ashamed to admit the problem. It was an epidemic hiding in plain sight, invisible because the addicts were proper people using legitimate medicine. The pharmaceutical industry recognised a growing problem and naturally responded with what they thought was a solution. If morphine was too addictive, perhaps a chemical modification would create something with morphine's benefits, but without the addiction potential. Scientists experimented with various morphine derivatives, and in 1874, a British chemist named C.R. Alder Wright synthesised diacetyl morphine. It sat on a shelf for 20 years, largely ignored, until the Bayer pharmaceutical company in Germany took an interest. Bayer tested diacetyl morphine and found it was extremely effective as a cough suppressant and pain reliever. It was also roughly twice as potent as morphine. They decided to market it under a brand name that would convey strength and effectiveness. They called it heroin, from the German heroisch, meaning heroic or strong. The name was meant to suggest that this drug would make patients feel heroic, powerful, capable. The irony is almost too painful to contemplate. Bayer launched heroin in 1898 with a massive marketing campaign. They advertised it as a safe, non-addictive substitute for morphine and codeine. They specifically marketed it for children's coughs and colds, heroin lozenges for kids, heroin elixir for respiratory problems. Advertisements showed wholesome images of families, with text promising quick relief from coughs, no harmful side effects suitable for children. It was, quite literally, one of the most catastrophic pharmaceutical marketing disasters in history. Because heroin is absolutely devastatingly addictive, more so than morphine. The acetyl groups allow it to cross the blood-brain barrier more quickly, producing a more intense rush. Users described it as the most pleasurable sensation imaginable, a warm, euphoric embrace that made all problems disappear. And that intensity made it psychologically addictive almost immediately. People who tried heroin for a cough ended up desperately addicted within weeks. By the early 1900s, as the scale of the disaster became clear, countries began banning or severely restricting heroin. Bayer stopped production in 1913. The damage was done, though. Heroin was out in the world. People knew how to make it. There was demand. And where there's demand, illegal supply follows. The heroin addiction crisis of the early 20th century directly contributed to the creation of modern drug prohibition laws, including the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 in the United States, which for the first time regulated and taxed the production, importation, and distribution of opiates. But prohibition didn't eliminate addiction. It just pushed it underground. Addicts who previously got their drugs from pharmacies and doctors now had to turn to illegal dealers. The drugs became less pure, more dangerous. Users had no way to know what they were taking or how strong it was. Overdoses increased. Crime associated with drug procurement increased. And because addiction was now illegal, addicts were treated as criminals rather than patients, making them less likely to seek help. Meanwhile, opium cultivation and trade continued globally. Turkey, Persia, India, China all continued growing poppies. Some production was legal for medical morphine and codeine. Some was illegal, feeding heroin markets. International treaties attempted to control the trade, with limited success. The League of Nations, and later the United Nations, created international drug control agencies. But opium poppies are easy to grow, morphine and heroin are easy to synthesize, and there's always been demand. Controlling it has proven nearly impossible. Throughout the 20th century, heroin addiction waxed and waned in different regions. Post-World War II Europe saw a heroin crisis. The United States experienced waves of heroin addiction in the 1960s and 70s, associated with returning Vietnam War veterans and urban poverty. The Golden Triangle, the mountainous region where Burma, Laos and Thailand meet, became a major opium and heroin production centre. Later, the Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Iran took over as the primary source. Each time authorities thought they were getting heroin addiction under control, it would surge back. Different demographics, different regions, but the same drug, the same devastation. By the late 20th century, you'd think we would have learned the lessons. You'd think we'd have figured out how to manage opium-derived drugs responsibly, how to provide them as medicine without creating addiction epidemics. You'd be wrong. Because in the 1990s we did it again. we created another opiate addiction crisis, this time with prescription painkillers, this time in America, this time killing hundreds of thousands, and this time we can't blame British merchants or Chinese smugglers or anyone except ourselves. The modern American opioid crisis has roots in the 1980s and 90s, when the medical community began reconsidering how it treated pain. For much of the 20th century, doctors were reluctant to prescribe opioids for chronic non-cancer pain. Too much risk of addiction, they thought. Too many problems with long-term use. But pain management advocates argued this was inhumane. People were suffering. Opioids were effective. Why deny patients relief because of exaggerated addiction fears? In 1996, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin, an extended-release formulation of oxycodone. This wasn't a new drug. Oxycodone had been around since 1916. But the extended-release formulation was designed to provide 12 hours of pain relief from a single pill. Purdue marketed it as a breakthrough in pain management, and they made a claim that would prove catastrophic, that OxyContin had a low risk of addiction, less than 1% according to some of their marketing materials. This claim was based on a 5-sentence letter to the editor in the New England Journal of Medicine from 1980, which observed that among hospital patients given opioids for acute pain, addiction was rare. But Purdue extrapolated from that tiny observation to claim that OxyContin, prescribed for chronic pain in outpatient settings, had similarly low addiction risk. It was a massive, unjustified leap, and it was false. Purdue's sales force aggressively promoted OxyContin to doctors. They downplayed addiction risks. They suggested it was appropriate for moderate pain, not just severe pain. They offered promotional materials, paid, speaking fees, sponsored conferences. They created a culture where prescribing opioids for chronic pain became normal, expected, the standard of care. Prescription rates skyrocketed. In 1991, about 76 million opioid prescriptions were written in the United States. By 2012, over 282 million. That's enough for every American adult to have their own bottle of pills. Dentists prescribed them for wisdom teeth extractions. Orthopedists prescribed them for minor injuries. Family doctors prescribed them for back pain, knee pain, any pain. Pills flooded communities, particularly rural areas and small towns that had been economically devastated by industrial decline. And people got addicted in huge numbers. Because, and this should surprise absolutely no one who's been paying attention to our 5,000-year history, opioids are addictive. Extended release doesn't make them less addictive. Taking them for legitimate pain doesn't prevent addiction. When you take opioids regularly, your brain changes. Tolerance develops. Dependence follows. And when you try to stop, withdrawal hits hard. Many patients who started taking OxyContin for a real injury found they couldn't stop without experiencing terrible withdrawal symptoms. So they kept taking it, and when their prescriptions ran out, they sought more pills, legally or otherwise. The illegal market for prescription opioids exploded. Pill mills opened in states like Florida, where unscrupulous doctors would prescribe opioids to anyone who paid cash, no questions asked. People would drive from across the country to these clinics, pick up massive prescriptions, and either use the pills themselves or sell them at huge markup. Pharmacies in small towns were ordering more opioids than could possibly be needed for legitimate medical use, distributing them to dealers and addicts. The system was breaking down, corrupted by money and addiction. Between 1999 and 2010, overdose deaths from prescription opioids quadrupled. Tens of thousands of Americans dying every year. Communities torn apart. And still, for years, the response was inadequate. Pharmaceutical companies continued aggressive marketing. Doctors continued prescribing. Regulators were slow to act. Eventually, as the scope of the crisis became undeniable, things began to change. Prescription monitoring programs were implemented. Doctors received education about opioid risks. Prescribing guidelines tightened. OxyContin's original formulation was replaced with a version harder to abuse. Law enforcement cracked down on pill mills. Purdue Pharma eventually faced lawsuits from states, counties, and individuals, ultimately pleading guilty to criminal charges and agreeing to pay billions in settlements. But by then, something else had happened. As prescription opioids became harder to obtain, addicted users turned to heroin. It was cheaper, more available, just as effective at staving off withdrawal. The second wave of the opioid crisis had begun. Heroin use in America, which had been declining, suddenly surged. But this wasn't the heroin of the 1970s. This was more potent, often mixed with other drugs, urban addicts, suburban addicts, rural addicts. The demographic was broader than any previous heroin crisis. Young people who'd gotten addicted to prescription pills after sports injuries or surgeries, middle-aged people who'd been prescribed opioids for chronic pain. The face of heroin addiction changed from the stereotypical inner-city user to include soccer moms and high school athletes, and the deaths mounted. From 2010 to 2015, heroin overdose deaths increased fivefold. But even that wasn't the worst of it. Because around 2013, a new player entered the American drug market: illicitly manufactured fentanyl. Fentanyl itself isn't new. It was developed in 1959 as a surgical anaesthetic and is still used medically today. It's extremely potent, 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine, which makes it useful for managing severe pain in controlled medical settings. A fentanyl patch can provide days of pain relief for cancer patients. Fentanyl injections are used in anaesthesia. When properly dosed and monitored, it's a valuable medicine. But illicitly manufactured fentanyl is different. It's made in clandestine labs, primarily in Mexico and China, using precursor chemicals that are relatively easy to obtain. The synthesis isn't particularly difficult for someone with basic chemistry knowledge, and because fentanyl is so potent, a small amount produces a lot of doses, making it easy to smuggle. A kilogram of fentanyl, which could fit in a backpack, contains enough pure drug to make millions of doses. Drug traffickers began mixing fentanyl into heroin to increase potency and profit. Some heroin sold on American streets became 50% fentanyl or more. Users had no way of knowing. They'd buy what they thought was heroin, inject their usual dose and overdose because it was actually fentanyl, which requires far less volume for the same effect. The margin of error vanished. A dose that would normally get you high could kill you if it contained fentanyl. Worse, traffickers started pressing fentanyl into counterfeit pills made to look like prescription opioids, Xanax or other pharmaceuticals. Young people who thought they were buying legitimate pills from a friend were actually getting fentanyl. One pill, sometimes half a pill, could be fatal. The crisis spread into populations that had never used heroin, people who would never consider themselves drug users, just kids experimenting with what they thought were pharmaceutical pills. The numbers from this third wave are horrifying. From 2013 to 2017, deaths from synthetic opioids increased tenfold. By 2017, synthetic opioids were involved in nearly 60% of all opioid overdose deaths. In 2020 and 2021, during the COVID pandemic, the crisis worsened as isolation, economic stress, and disrupted treatment services pushed deaths even higher. Over 100,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in 2021, the majority involving fentanyl. To put that in perspective, that's more American deaths in a single year than the entire Vietnam War. Every year. Year after year. And unlike the Opium Wars, which we can blame on British imperialism, unlike earlier heroin crises with complex social and geopolitical causes, this is something we did to ourselves through a combination of corporate greed, regulatory failure, inadequate addiction treatment, and refusal to learn from history. The pharmaceutical industry pushed opioids despite knowing the risks. Doctors prescribed them without adequate training or caution. Insurance companies often refused to cover alternative pain treatments, but readily covered opioid prescriptions. The FDA approved opioid medications based on inadequate evidence of safety for long-term use. And when addiction crisis emerged, the response was to criminalize users rather than treat them as patients with a medical condition. We've seen some progress recently. Naloxone, the opioid overdose reversal drug, is now more widely available. Some cities have implemented needle exchange programs and safe injection sites. Medication-assisted treatment with methadone or buprenorphine, while still stigmatized and inadequate, has expanded. Prescription rates have declined, and in 2023, for the first time in years, overdose deaths began to decrease slightly, though they remain catastrophically high. But we're still dealing with the fundamental contradiction that's existed for 5,000 years. Opioids are extraordinarily effective medicine. They relieve pain better than almost anything else. They're essential for surgery, for cancer care, for managing severe acute pain. We can't simply ban them. But they're also extraordinarily addictive and dangerous. Finding the balance, providing access for legitimate medical need while preventing addiction and diversion to illegal use, remains an unsolved problem. And it's not just an American problem anymore. Canada is experiencing a similar fentanyl crisis. Parts of Europe are seeing increasing opioid overdoses. Australia has its own prescription opioid issues. The global nature of drug trafficking means fentanyl is spreading wherever there's demand for opioids. This is a worldwide crisis with roots stretching back to those Sumerian poppy fields. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at the broader picture. How did opium, this single plant, change the world so profoundly? The ripple effects are almost beyond counting. Economically, opium helped build the British Empire. The profits from the China opium trade funded British industrialisation, infrastructure, and further colonial expansion. Hong Kong, one of the world's great financial centres, exists because of the Opium Wars. The British East India Company, later dissolved but foundational to British corporate capitalism, was deeply involved in opium trafficking. You can draw a direct line from Mesopotamian poppy cultivation to modern, global capitalism. Medically, opium gave us morphine, codeine, and eventually synthetic opioids like fentanyl. These remain essential medicines. Modern surgery would be impossible without opioid anaesthetics. Cancer care, trauma medicine, acute pain management all rely on opioids. The medical revolution of the 19th and 20th centuries was built in part on our ability to control pain, and opioids were central to that. At the same time, we've learned repeatedly that these powerful medicines can destroy lives when misused. Politically, opium shaped international relations. The Opium Wars established patterns of Western imperialism in Asia that persisted for over a century. China's century of humiliation, driven by forced opium imports, still influences Chinese foreign policy today. The country's fierce protection of sovereignty, suspicion of Western intentions, drive toward economic and military strength, these all have roots in the trauma of being conquered by drug traffickers with gunboats. Understanding the Opium Wars is essential to understanding modern China. Legally, opium drove the creation of international drug control regimes. The first international drug control treaty, the International Opium Convention of 1912, was a direct response to opium addiction crises in China and elsewhere. The League of Nations and later the United Nations established drug control bodies that continue to operate today. The Harrison Act, the Controlled Substances Act, the DEA, all of these institutions and laws exist because society struggled to control opium and its derivatives. Culturally, opium has been woven into art, literature, and popular consciousness. The Romantic poets and their opium-fueled visions, Victorian novels filled with laudanum-addicted characters, 20th century literature exploring heroin addiction, modern film and television depicting the opioid crisis. Opium has been muse, monster, and metaphor for over 2 centuries of creative output. Socially, opium and opioid addiction have consistently devastated communities, particularly marginalised ones. Chinese coastal cities in the 19th century, American inner cities in the 1970s, rural Appalachia in the 2000s. The pattern repeats: economic decline, limited opportunities, readily available opioids, spiralling addiction, community collapse. And each time the response has been inadequate: criminalisation over treatment, moral judgment over medical care. And scientifically, studying opium led to fundamental discoveries in neuroscience. The identification of opioid receptors in the brain in the 1970s, the discovery of endogenous opioid peptides like endorphins that the body produces naturally, the understanding of how addiction changes brain structure and function. Modern neuroscience and our knowledge of the brain's reward systems have roots in trying to understand how opium works. So when we ask, how did opium change history? The answer is, profoundly, in ways both positive and catastrophically negative, across virtually every aspect of human civilization. This one plant, Papaver somniferum, has touched more lives, shaped more events, caused more suffering, and provided more relief than perhaps any other plant in human history. Tobacco, cannabis, cocaine, none have the same historical depth, the same persistent impact across 5 millennia, and the story isn't over. Right now, scientists are working on developing non-addictive pain medications that could provide opiate-level pain relief without the risk of dependency. If successful, this would be revolutionary, potentially ending the cycle of pain treatment leading to addiction that's plagued medicine for over a century. But we've thought we solved the opium problem before. Morphine was going to replace opium. Heroin was going to replace morphine. OxyContin was going to be a safe opioid. Each time we were wrong. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe we've finally learned the lessons history has been trying to teach us. Or maybe, human nature being what it is, we'll find new ways to repeat old mistakes. Right now, in Afghanistan, despite the Taliban's recent ban, poppy fields still bloom every spring. In Mexico, cartels continue manufacturing fentanyl. In America and around the world, hundreds of thousands of people struggle with opioid addiction. And in hospitals everywhere, doctors still prescribe opioids for legitimate pain, because sometimes there's no better option, walking that narrow line between relief and addiction. The paradox remains: we need these drugs. They're essential medicine. They alleviate suffering that would otherwise be unbearable. But they're also incredibly dangerous, capable of destroying individuals, families, and entire communities. We've known this for 5,000 years. The Sumerians knew it. Dioscorides knew it. Linzexu knew it. And yet here we are, still struggling with the same fundamental problem. How do we harness opium's benefits while avoiding its catastrophic costs? Maybe there's no perfect answer. Maybe the tension between relief and addiction, between medicine and poison, is inherent to these substances. Maybe the best we can do is remain vigilant, learn from history, approach opioids with respect and caution, provide treatment instead of punishment for those who become addicted, and keep searching for better solutions. As we wind down tonight, I want you to think about the human element in all of this. Behind every statistic, every historical event, every policy debate, there are real people. The Sumerian farmer who first discovered that opium eased his pain after a hard day's work. The Chinese father who lost his family to addiction while his emperor was powerless to stop the British drug trade. The Civil War veteran who came home with morphine dependency and suffered in silence. The modern teenager who took what they thought was a prescription pill and never woke up. The cancer patient grateful for pain relief in their final days. The doctor trying to help patients while navigating the risks of opioid prescriptions. None of these people are just statistics. They're us. Humanity in all its complexity, seeking relief from suffering, making mistakes, trying to help, sometimes causing harm despite good intentions, struggling with addiction, celebrating medical breakthroughs, grappling with mortality and pain, and the desperate hope for something better. The story of opium is, ultimately, a deeply human story. It's about our vulnerability to both pain and pleasure, our willingness to exploit others for profit, our capacity for compassion, and our capacity for cruelty, our genius for medicine, and our foolishness in wielding powerful tools without fully understanding the consequences. It's about empires and addicts, scientists and smugglers, suffering and relief, all woven together across 5,000 years. And maybe, if we remember this history, if we understand how we got here, we can do better going forward. We can approach pain management with appropriate caution. We can treat addiction as a medical condition, not a moral failing. We can prioritize human welfare over corporate profits. We can learn from the mistakes of the Opium Wars and the OxyContin disaster and every crisis in between. We can be wiser than our ancestors, even as we honor the genuine medical advances they achieved. Or maybe we won't. Maybe we'll keep repeating the same patterns, making the same mistakes, learning the same lessons over and over. History suggests that's the more likely outcome, honestly. But hope springs eternal. And in that hope, in the possibility of doing better, of finding solutions, of reducing suffering without creating new forms of it, that's where we have to place our faith. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the 5,000-year journey we've taken, from Sumerian joy plant to British imperial weapon to modern pharmaceutical crisis, from ancient temples to Chinese opium dens to American suburbs, from Morpheus to morphine to fentanyl, one plant, countless lives, enduring impact. And if you've made it this far, if you've listened to this entire story, thank you. Hit that like button if you found this informative, subscribe for more deep dives into history, and drop a comment letting me know what you think, what surprised you, what connections you see to the world today. I read all the comments, and I love hearing your perspectives. If you or someone you know is struggling with opioid addiction, help is available. The SAMHSA National Helpline is 1-800-662-437. It's free, confidential, available 24/7. Addiction is a medical condition. It's treatable. You don't have to face it alone. All right, my friends. That's our journey through opium's history. Rest well, dream peacefully. And remember, history isn't just the past. It's the present and the future too. Constantly unfolding. Always teaching us if we're willing to learn. Good night.